and we will, there we go, and we will then, of course, put this webinar up onto our YouTube channel of 4SA once it is recorded and complete. So before we get into tonight, just a little housekeeping, so to speak. So we've got the chat function and the questions and answers at the bottom of the page. So you guys can, of course, put any questions you might have, obviously preferably relating to the topic, but if there's any burning questions that you need to know an answer to, then please don't be shy. We will do our best to answer it during the course of tonight, and if for any reason we can't, the 4SA team will of course engage you. And as always, we try to stick to our time limit of finishing promptly at 8 p.m. But forgive us if we go 1 or 2 minutes over. We know that these are important topics, but of course, I will do the best to play timekeeper. And so as we start tonight, this particular topic is very relevant at the moment, and perhaps one that some of you have heard the term cancel culture. For others, it might be a new term that you are not familiar with, but in essence, the topic tonight is how cancel culture crushes conservative Christian values. You can't say that in a rush. And in essence, what we are discussing tonight is there is a modern form of ostracism and bullying taking place, known as cancel culture. Now, depending on what side of the spectrum you sit, if you sit on the left-hand side of the spectrum, which is the more liberal side, they would see cancel culture as a very positive thing. In other words, if somebody says something or does something that people of the left don't agree with, they will go on a mission to cancel them. And basically that would mean boycotting them financially, perhaps on social media, ostracizing them. But now, if you sit on the right-hand side of the spectrum, which is considered the more conservative side, you would see cancel culture as a very negative thing, because if the majority of society is left-leaning, that means that anything that someone who is conservative, or in our instance, biblically minded, would say or do, the majority of the media, politicians, and general society would try to cancel you. In the instance, if you're a public figure, that could be, for example, writing negative articles about you. It could be boycotting shows if you're a musician. If you're a business person, it could be doing boycotts outside your business, or forcing other shopkeepers not to keep your products. And so we can see how cancel culture can very easily be manipulated, and equally so be very destructive. And so tonight we are exploring that cancel culture, and again, bringing it back to South Africa. Where do we sit as Christians within the context of society, as the church, within the context and how we relate to government? And all these issues are so important right now as we fight on the front lines of faith. And of course, those who are upholding that good fight are the wonderful team at 4SA. They are a team of legal specialists. We've got advocates, we've got lawyers and attorneys, and we also have just general people working there who are really volunteering their time, who are committed to the cause. Some of them are employed at very minimal salaries, and they deserve much more. But as an NPO, they do their best to get the good work out there. So that's why Joy, together with 4SA, have partnered for these webinars to basically educate and inform Christians at home about issues that either do concern you or should be concerning you, because we need to stand as watchmen on the wall. Now, enough from me babbling. I want to hand over to my guest tonight. We've got Michael Swain, familiar to many of you at home. He is I want to say operations director of 4SA, but Michael, you need to just correct my terminology there. And then we've got Daniela Ellerbeck, and she is an attorney at 4SA. So guys, welcome, and over to you for tonight's webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Jackie. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Well, to give me my exalted title, I am the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, which means that I basically just am made to look very, very smart and very clever by the wonderful people that I work with, particularly my learned and esteemed colleague, Daniela Ellerbeck. So it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you to everybody for joining us for what we hope will be a very interesting discussion.
Wonderful. So we're going to jump straight into it because there's a lot to discuss tonight. And Michael, I'm going to start with you first. For those who are new onto the webinar tonight, or perhaps have forgotten, tell us a little bit about 4SA and what you do in the context of freedom of religion and belief.
Well, 4SA stands for Freedom of Religion South Africa, and we are a legal advocacy group. And what that means is that we have a limited but very vital mandate to protect and promote our constitutional rights to religious freedom. So Section 15 of our Constitution gives us the right to have freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. Sometimes it's referred to as FORB, freedom of religion and belief rights, because it's actually a little bit broader than just freedom of religion per se. And also that right is, of course, further protected by Section 9 of our Constitution, the so-called Equality Clause, which means that nobody can be unfairly discriminated against on the basis of, and it lists a number of categories, and amongst them, of course, is conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. So it is such a critical right to defend because it is basically the baseline of everything that we and those of any faith would believe. And it's not just a question of believing in your heart. This is something which is so important to understand. It is a right which goes way beyond that. It is a right to express your belief, and that will be in terms of what you say, what you speak, what you record, what you post, what you might film, what you might draw, what you might write, and then, of course, to live out your faith, to freely be able to express your faith, to associate with other people of like-minded faith, so to speak, to pass your faith on to your children, and to share it freely with others. And that is the right that our Constitution protects. That is the right that our Constitutional Court has upheld in all that respect. Even if your belief is bizarre or irrational or illogical, it is still protected. So it is your right to believe whatever you want, or frankly, to not believe anything at all if you so want, but to be able to live that out freely in our wonderful democratic society.
Wonderful. And something important worth noting is that 4SA is not a church organization or doctrinally specific. You undergird and support the whole body of Christ, which is really important because there are so many things that should unite us as Christians rather than divide us. And you guys certainly focus on that, which I appreciate, Michael. Now, Daniela, I want to ask you, practically speaking, what does 4SA actually do on a day-to-day or monthly or weekly basis?
So, Jackie, as Michael said, we're a legal advocacy organization and we protect religious freedom. So practically, that means that we work in front of Parliament when they have proposed laws called bills that they're looking at, and we screen these bills to see whether or not they would impact on religious freedom, and if they will, we give input. The same with departments, where bills start off of often. Same with policies in front of departments, and then also we get involved in front of other state organizations such as the Chapter 9s, like Commission for Gender Equality, the South African Human Rights Commission, when they investigate complaints that have to do with infringements of rights and religious freedom is involved, as well as, of course, like in front of the courts where there's cases. So basically, anywhere and everywhere that the right to religious freedom is affected, we get involved.
Wonderful. And let me ask the two of you, because obviously tonight's topic is about cancel culture. Can you unpack that a little bit for our viewers at home and just maybe how cancel culture actually operates?
Right. So basically, Jackie, in simple terms, it's bullying for grown-ups. And, you know, if conservative people, we tend to be polite. We tend not to want to rock the boat. And as a result of that, you know, we often don't share our views and we self-censor, which is actually like an indirect pressure that we exert on ourselves, because we actually feel like, okay, well, our views aren't going to be welcome to be heard. People are going to get upset if we say it. So we rather don't say it. And that's one of the forms that cancel culture takes. You know, effectively, we cancel ourselves there.
Yeah,
You know, I think it's important to say that there is also this whole new thing relatively in our woke world that we live in called intersectionality. And intersectionality is basically a hierarchy of minorities. So people who were in some way, shape or form previously disadvantaged, they get, if you like, a louder voice or a more important voice. And depending upon whether or not you belong to multiple intersectionality groups, your voice should be louder and louder. So, for example, if you are a woman, that would definitely put you one rung up on men. If you are, for example, of a formerly minority religious grouping, for example, if you believe in Islam, that would also give you, in a sense, a little rung up the ladder. And obviously, you've got the LGBT groups as well. So for me, I would be right at the bottom of the ladder on the intersectional hierarchy. I'm a cisgender white male from the UK, which makes me a colonialist as well. And so again, it is ridiculous in a sense, but that would mean that, you know, in terms of this cancel culture, my voice should be effectively suppressed because I'm part of the, you know, male patriarchy. I shouldn't really be allowed to speak. But that in itself, if you think about it, is sexist. It might even be racist. So it is unfortunately the world we live in, where your voice is either amplified or repressed, depending upon where you sit in terms of the culture that we live in. And it is very, very concerning. And I can give you a couple of very concerning examples. So perhaps the most concerning, we 4SA were involved in a public participation process with the Western Cape Department of Education. And they were developing guidelines on sort of sexuality policies within schools. In other words, how should schools deal with some of these issues that crop up? And as part of that, we invited a medical doctor to present, not as an expert, but just because he's interested in the topic, to present some international papers that dealt with some of the issues surrounding the transgender situation. And they're peer-reviewed studies, they're international, they're very important because they spoke directly to the heart of the matter. They were giving indications of some of the experiences in other nations, which have shown that it is very concerning, some of the impacts that it has on young children in particular. And all he was basically saying was, look, if we need to consider the best interests of children, we really need to take stock of some of these reports and to bear them in mind before we pass a policy based as it is on an ideology. Transgenderism in and of itself is an ideology. And the backlash that came against him for just simply presenting other people's work peer-reviewed was intense. They were trying to disbar him. They were trying to say that he should never be able to practice as a psychology. Petitions were going around. They literally went after him as hard as they can. That's a very concerning thing because, again, you would think in a public participation process organized by government, of all the places where there should be the opportunity for robust debate and for opinions, even diverse opinions, to be shared, that would be it. But unfortunately, that is not the case. To give you a couple of international examples, our well-known Angus Buchan, when he was going to do a tour of Scotland, speaking engagements in Scotland and the UK, he was literally cancelled. They would not allow him venues within which to speak, not because of what he had said, but because of what they were afraid that he might say. And so they basically just cancelled the whole tour. And more recently, another organization that we've worked with very closely in times past and associated with in the UK, they run on university campuses, on the University of Cambridge, a program. And they went to Worcester College in Cambridge, which formerly was actually set up originally as a Christian entity when it was first founded. And they were teaching something called the Wilberforce Academy, which just teaches a whole range of different views and what have you. Somebody heard about it, never attended any of their lectures, and complained to the university. And as a consequence, they have now been basically deplatformed. They're not allowed at this stage to go back to that same campus. So it has very practical, very real impacts upon people in their lives.
Absolutely. And I think the best way to sum it up is to say that the popular consensus around cancel culture is you're entitled to your opinion and express it as long as it fits with my opinion. And if it doesn't fit with my opinion, I'll cancel you, I will object, I will boycott. And that's the biggest issue, is it's a false sense of freedom of speech. It's a false sense of freedom of religion. It's a false sense of democracy, because it actually is intolerance and bullying, as you guys said. So let me ask the two of you, why is freedom of speech and the right to be able to express yourself both privately and publicly so important within a society?
Well, Jackie, firstly, it's one of the rights that allow us to live in a democracy, right? If we are able to actually give our opinions on laws and policies that government is considering, like what Michael said, participate in the democratic process and make our voices heard. In the simplest form, actually, like casting a vote, making your voice heard that way. But it's also a right that's protected in our Constitution's Bill of Rights. So it's one of the entrenched fundamental rights in our Constitution, that you have the right to say your say and share your ideas with others, and also hear their ideas. And it's not a right that we always had as South Africans. I mean, we only need to look back at apartheid, which in the 1980s, there were so many things that were censored and illegal, and meetings that were illegal. You couldn't say certain things, you couldn't listen to certain things, certain books were banned, and that just is in our country's recent history. So you would think that in South Africa, of all countries, because of our recent history that involved such a struggle for freedom and for the right to freedom of expression, that we would really hold this value very, very dear.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably important to give some practical examples of this. So, for instance, not so very long ago, believe it or not, slavery was something which was largely accepted in the world. And yet it was a Christian man, William Wilberforce, who basically stood up and said no. Now, initially, his pleas went on deaf ears, but because he was living in a democratic society where they could continue to talk, he began to persuade, and obviously others then joined the cause, and then very ultimately, literally right at the end of his life, slavery was abolished, and subsequently was abolished in all democratic so-called Western nations, and even in nations that had formerly been colonized. It was because robust debate existed. Other figures in history who were basically shut down because they disagreed with, or they said something against the status quo. Galileo, for example, who discovered that the Earth actually revolves around the sun. He was literally placed under house arrest for daring to share a viewpoint which conflicted with the, if you like, the educational, the elite, the ruling class status quo of the time. And he died literally under house arrest. And Daniela talks about things that even in our recent past, often it shuts down culture. So you might remember the Pink Floyd album, The Wall, we don't need no education. That was banned under apartheid because it was something which they thought was threatening to the status quo. They literally cancelled that particular song of that particular album's band. So very, very concerning, because it is literally the antithesis of democracy. If you shut down one side of the debate for whatever reason, you literally are limiting the opportunity to find the very solutions that actually can lead to a better world for everybody.
And I think to that point, that's what most people misunderstand about Christians and Christianity is we actually stand for freedom of religion for everyone. Even if someone is not a Christian, we believe that people have the right to not believe. And we stand for freedom of expression for everyone, but within the context of mutual respect, because you can, I've got to be careful with my words, because I know in this particular context, there's so many minefields we have to think of all the time. But even the fact that we have to be careful of our words, it's so irritating, because we should be able to just speak plainly and freely with one another. But that leads me into my next question. So one of the arguments that gets hurled towards Christians is that a lot of what we say borders on discrimination or hate speech. And obviously, you know, free speech, it's a murky line, because everyone should have freedom of speech, but there should be certain constraints, because I think that people can be very destructive. So how does one just work out what is protected as far as free speech is concerned, and where do the lines get crossed?
Well, I think, Jackie, just to backtrack for one moment, I think one of the most important things when we're talking about freedom of speech is that it literally is that. It doesn't matter, and perhaps where the greatest danger lies, is that whichever way you might view your ideological spectrum, whether you're left or right or somewhere in the middle, one of the biggest concerns is, and I think it's an increasing concern in the society that we live in, is whichever side you're on, there is a tendency to think, well, if I could only just grab the levers of power, then I could then have my viewpoint pushed out. I don't like it when it's being pushed back against me. So if only I could just grab those levers of power somehow, and then I could push my view down on them because mine is the better view. But unfortunately, when both sides think that, then you ultimately end up with a very concerning and very detrimental outcome, because whenever you have, if you like, governmental power combining forces with any form of belief system, somebody's going to suffer. And it's interesting that this month we celebrate Freedom of Religion Day on October the 27th. And you might recall the story of the pilgrims who left the United Kingdom in the Mayflower, and they sailed to the New World, and they established their colony. And they did so because they were fleeing religious persecution, because their beliefs were literally causing them to suffer severe persecution. Now, when they had set themselves up and they'd established their colony and everything was all in order, what happened rather concerningly was that another group arose called the Quakers. And the Quakers had a different understanding of the scriptures in certain areas. And the Puritans, you would have thought, would have been the most amenable people. I mean, they'd suffered perhaps, terribly as a consequence of their own faith being persecuted by authority. But they were the first people to persecute the Quakers, and they literally hanged to death 4 Quakers as a consequence of basically being able to use the power of government to push and enforce their particular belief. So whenever you see government lining up with any ideology, it's always going to end up badly for someone.
So then, given what you've just said and the reality of that, obviously I understand why then, say on our constitutional side, they try to put in checks and balances against hate speech and discrimination, etc., etc. But who decides what hate speech is? Because hate speech, as far as I'm concerned, would be considered quite different to somebody who doesn't subscribe to biblical values and sees the Bible in its entirety as hate speech. So Daniela, maybe you can just elaborate on that for us, as far as, where do those parameters lie?
So Jackie, our Constitution protects speech, and then it gives 3 grounds that it says is not protected speech. The first is propaganda for war, which hopefully no Christian would ever make themselves guilty of. Incitement of imminent violence, which also hopefully no Christian will make themselves guilty of. And then the third ground is what is commonly referred to as hate speech. And the Constitution defines that quite narrowly and says, okay, that's the advocacy of hatred. So I'm busy stirring up hatred in someone. That constitutes the incitement to cause harm. And our Court actually recently had a case where it also laid down a definition for hate speech, which is very similar to the constitutional definition for hate speech. And basically they said the same thing, which is like, it's speech that if a reasonable person had to read it, or if a reasonable person had to hear it, they would understand that speech as, being intended to promote or stir up hatred in someone when they read and hear it, and then to go do something about it. So to incite harm. So that is, that's wonderful. That the definition for hate speech is very, very limited, because obviously the wider you define the things that you're not allowed to say, that's not protected speech, the smaller and smaller and smaller what you can say becomes. And I think what's important to note there is that hurtful speech or offensive speech is not hate speech. Okay, so it's speech that's harmful is hate speech. And so in a robust and democratic and vibrant society like ours, you should be expected to be able to say things that are possibly, you know, going to hurt someone emotionally, or going to offend someone. And that should be protected.
But then, Daniela, I'm going to put you on the spot now, as I like to do. If that's the case, then my first question is, one, if hate speech is quite narrowly defined, then why should we as Christians be concerned about the hate speech bill? Because we all hear this bill and get panicky. Kind of address those two juxtapositions for me.
Well, let me kick off with the hate speech bill and why we were so concerned about it. And again, thank you so much for everybody who sent submissions in on that to Parliament. So important that we take the opportunity to have our voice and to make sure that our voice is heard. So the first thing about it was that it, for the first time in South African legal history, makes what you say, speech, even if you pass on somebody else's speech, a criminal offence. So carrying 3 years in jail or potentially a limitless fine for a first offence. So that's a big one. And I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that, again, whenever hate speech comes into play, part of the impact of it isn't so much somebody who maybe gets actually charged with hate speech, which is a very real possibility, but it's the concern that I might be charged with it. You know, maybe I do say something which somehow oversteps a boundary, and the next thing the police arrive at my door and arrest me, and I have to go through a court process. So even if I'm found not guilty, I'm still going to have some form of criminal record. And that in itself just inhibits people from saying what it is, what they might otherwise have said, which could be perfectly fine and fair. The other problem with the hate speech bill was, of course, that the definition of hate speech was in fact broader than the definition that the Constitutional Court handed down in the Kwalani case. It wasn't an incitement to do harm and to sort of propagate some form of hatred. It was the word or. So even if you had done something which incited harm, even if you hadn't advocated hatred, then that would have potentially caught you in the net, and that would have been a criminal issue that you'd then be facing. And harm was defined also seemingly very broadly. It included things like social harm and psychological harm and emotional harm. And again, when these things are not defined, it just leaves everything very open-ended. And so you actually don't quite know what it is that you might come up with when it comes to being charged for hate speech. And you know, to address the political issue, there is definitely a distinction regarding what you can and cannot say when it comes to politics and when it comes to, let's say, religious speech, generally speaking. And it was interesting to me to read the minister, police minister, his comments about how they're now changing their policy for the police. They're saying, look, you know, we're not going to, particularly when it comes to large-scale political gatherings, we need to be a little bit careful here, because you know we don't want to be seen to be interfering. But they'll happily go to a religious gathering, and they don't seem to have too much concern about what happens there. So again, it is obviously something which is not necessarily a balanced and a completely fair and even scale in the way that this thing is treated, and that is part of the problem.
Yeah.
Jackie, so, can you jump in there?
Of course.
Okay, wonderful. No, I was going to say, definitely comes down to whether or not the prosecution has the will to prosecute. Because even if you tick all the boxes, you know, government still needs to decide, are we actually going to prosecute this person for this crime? Yeah. And definitely, I think with political things, people are very sensitive, and it is a double standard. You know, there's one standard for the political community that they can get away with, but for the church, there's another one. Yeah, so, and definitely, like Michael said, you know, it's the definitions itself in the hate speech bill that make it dangerous.
And I think our other concern about the hate speech bill was, of course, that when it first came about, there was a great outcry, because just about anything that you could or might have said from the pulpit potentially would have been hate speech in the bill in its initial iteration. And there was a big outcry against that, which was wonderful. And as a consequence, the Department of Justice wrote in a religious exemption clause, which basically protects bona fide preaching, teaching, proselytizing on the basis of your faith or tenets of your religion or what have you, that obviously does not advocate hatred and incite violence. That was fair enough. But unfortunately, when we subsequently heard the Deputy Minister of Justice speaking about it to Parliament, he was of the view that it would protect, say, a pastor preaching on a Sunday, but it would not necessarily give that same protection to somebody who might repeat exactly what they'd heard on a Sunday or on a Friday in a mosque. And if you did that, or if you posted something on Facebook, potentially then you would not be protected by the religious exemption clause. So again, we were very clear that we must strengthen that religious exemption clause so that religious speech is truly and properly protected when we see the final version that goes through Parliament of this hate speech bill.
So guys, I'm digressing a little bit from tonight and talking about cancel culture, but in a sense, obviously the hate speech bill in itself is like the epitome of cancel culture. But what I want to ask you on that point is, for those of us watching at home and online, so where do we sit with the hate speech bill in terms of, like, what do the next steps look like? So obviously there was an overwhelming objection from the public, and I suppose government needs to consider those objections and maybe rework something. But as far as you guys are concerned with 4SA and you know, taking charge of the process, what does that look like over the next few months or days or weeks?
Okay, so Jackie, just to briefly answer your question, and I mean, we will be doing a whole article for viewers who are interested. We'll be doing a whole article in Joy on the public participation process and what that looks like and how that breaks down in their January issue, I think it is. Yes. So make sure to read that article when it comes out. But to break it down, so the bill is currently in Parliament, and Parliament has two houses. So the bill is in front of the first house in Parliament, and they have now asked for public comments. They've received everyone's comments. Thank you to everyone who sent in comments. It's so important. And they will now review those comments, speak to their legal teams, get their parties' positions and all of that, and then sit together as a house and committee and decide, okay, are we going to change this bill this way? What's it going to look like? They'll make the changes that they want to the bill. And if they're happy, they will say, okay, we pass it on to the second house. And the same process gets repeated in the second house of Parliament. We'll have a chance to have a say again on the draft bill, the way it looks then after it's been amended. They'll look at it, they'll see if they're happy with it, they'll pass it if they're happy with it. And only after both houses have passed it will it go to the president to be signed into law. So we still have another round of public participation. Hopefully, you know, the bill, when it gets to the National Council of Provinces, the second house will really be in tip-top form. So
yeah, no, that's great to know. And in a sense, a question I want to ask you, but if I'm putting you on the spot, I'm sorry, but it's just I don't get a chance to like speak to you guys. But do you think that
what are you talking about? We talk every week.
No, but there's so much more. Okay, this is the last question I'm going to ask off script, and then I'll go back to the script. But do you think that a lot of the legal advisors to government, and I could say this to an American government as much as a South African one, I'm not trying to point fingers, but I'm just asking your opinions. But do you think that, like, legal advisors in government, obviously in the context for us of our country, do you think that when they make some amendments to bills that they specifically and cunningly and cleverly are trying to put things in a box in a corner because they obviously, being legally minded, know further down the line what it's going to look like? Or do you think that maybe sometimes these legal advisors they set certain parameters and make certain adjustments, but they don't actually think of the practical application? Because let's say in the context of a church or religious organization, some of them have never set foot in a church, so they wouldn't even understand that a person would forward on a preach or something, you know, because I think sometimes as Christians, on the one hand, there's a lot of Christians who give everyone the benefit of the doubt and can be very naive, which I think drives passivity. But then on the other hand, I think Christians can be so suspicious that they see a demon behind every doorknob and sort of run around pushing conspiracy theories. So where do you guys sort of take the line on that?
Jackie, I think that the answer to that question is that it's very difficult sometimes for a legal advisor who has got maybe a whole spectrum of different things that they're trying to consider to actually understand the law of unintended consequences. And that's really often one of the problems. I don't think that necessarily government is at all, specifically trying to come up with some sort of devious scheme and plan. But unfortunately, sometimes things that are passed into law have unintended consequences. And I think the Papuda is probably a very good example of that, because in 2000 it was passed, and it was passed with a definition which 21 years later was ruled to be unconstitutional and therefore unlawful. But the fact of the matter is that as a law, it had been in force and enforceable for 21 years. So the law of unintended consequences, what we're trying to do, and we actually have had a positive meeting with the Deputy Minister, John Jeffrey, interestingly enough, who said to us, look, please let's be in closer contact, because it is so much better to start to influence things at the policy level when these things are first being discussed. So then at that point, you could bring, well, look, here's the application, or here's the possible concerns that you might want to consider from the faith community, for example, or from other communities. And so I think it would be very well advised to government to actually be more inclusive in the policy making process, so that they can, when they come to the drafting of these laws, already have taken into account some of the things which are going to subsequently raise their heads as deep concerns. And we would not typically have had such a problem with the Papuda Amendment Bill if we had simply been given some form of input opportunity into it before it was actually drafted. And so rather than, if you like, fighting the battle when it's literally against the gates of the city, it's much better to actually be more proactive and to start to deal with these things when you're 100 miles away, and you can certainly have a much more positive, I think, influence at that time. And that's something that we're literally going to be proposing to government in the coming days.
So I think the legal advisors and the MPs themselves, the members of parliament, I don't think they always have like a hidden evil agenda or anything like that. There definitely are lobby groups that lobby for specific ideologies and specific viewpoints. And again, if you're an MP and this is the only viewpoint that you're being lobbied with, it's the only one you're hearing all the time, I'm pretty sure that you'll probably start to think that way as well. So that's definitely what we as 4SA also try and do, is actually be a voice and a lobby group for the religious community with government, and actually bring the religious community's viewpoints and concerns and rights to their fore.
Yeah, and Daniela, you actually said exactly what I was about to say, that when I listen to what you guys say now, and the sort of critical nature that it is for the Christian voice to be represented early on in the process, it just reiterates to me how important it is that 4SA gets the support that it needs from not only the Christian community at large as individuals, but also from churches and pastors, because ultimately the fight that you are taking up is on all of our behalves. And in the instance of a lot of churches and ministers, I mean, they find themselves on the front lines without even realizing it, because the microscope is really hovering above them. So I want to just, take a moment, and I know there's other things we're going to discuss, but I want to take a moment in this discussion to say the following, that when I hear how critical it is, the work that you're doing, and the sort of in-depth nature of what you do, and why it has to be from the beginning, infant stages, it just is it's a beacon and a warning, so to speak, to us as the Christian community, to say we need to be supporting and strengthening and holding up the hands of the leaders like yourselves who are doing this work, because you can't go into battle with a world-class military with some, with a little catty. It's not going to make an impact. And I'm not speaking on a spiritual level, because obviously we know that one with God is a majority, but I'm speaking that literally and physically on a very practical level. the louder our voice is, the more united our voice is, the stronger our voice is, the more opportunity we have for representation at both policy level, at government level, and just in general in the media. So I do want to encourage those of you watching to please consider supporting 4SA, not only with your prayers, which are really important, but also with financial contributions, because they can't do the work they do without money. It takes money to fly up to court cases and to stand before the High Court and the Con Courts. It takes money to work on documents and submissions. I mean, just the paper alone, I've seen what some of those submissions look like. I mean, it's ridiculous. And you have to, you have to get people to proof it, and there's hours of work involved. Even just to get Christians to come together for a campaign, it involves internet costs, mailer costs, telephone calls, and data costs. So, I think you guys are very professional and very respectful in how you present the work you do. And it's difficult for you to be straightforward, but I'm going to be straightforward on your behalf and say, you can't do what you do if we don't do our part. And our part is to show up, to financially support you guys, to prayerfully support you guys. And when you make a call for a campaign for people to sign a petition or whatever the case may be, that we need to do that too. So I think that's an important point that just needs to be made tonight. But
Jackie, well, I mean, just want to say thank you so much for that. We've been doing this now for 8 years, and I think we, 4SA, have built up a very good reputation. I think we've done very well in terms of what we've managed to achieve. I think the religious landscape of this country would probably look a lot different, by the way, if we hadn't been here doing what we do. But that's why we exist. Pastors, religious leaders, they have a calling. They have a job to do. They shouldn't be worrying about what's happening, unless, of course, somebody, which would be us, says, hey, we need your help, we need your support, we need now your voice to be heard. But let us do what we do. We are here to protect and promote religious freedom rights. And we do need your support to do that, so that you, in turn, can live out your faith, can practice your faith, can preach your faith, can teach your faith, and can pass your faith on to your children and your children's children. That's what we exist to do. So we certainly appreciate and need your support. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you said, Michael, often Christians are maybe, let's just be honest, not the most professional when they submit things, or they don't do things properly. But 4SA as an organization, obviously, given the nature of the work you do and the fact that you guys are legally minded, is you do things properly, you do things with credibility and ethics. And that alone, for me, is why you're worth supporting, because there's so few people standing up and doing things properly. So, I mean, we really do appreciate you guys. And those of you at home, you can obviously find out more information about 4SA on their website. And of course, with these webinars, we have recorded them, they go onto a YouTube channel, and we encourage you to share the links and to get your pastor, get your friends, your family. Any Christian should be watching these seminars to see what the great need is as far as working together in unity to fight for freedom of religion and family and faith and values. So just to round up the discussion tonight, because I see the time is ticking away. So let me ask you guys, what, in terms of cancel culture, what is the end result with cancel culture? It's one thing to hear about a celebrity being canceled because of their stance on Israel, for example. But realistically speaking, is there something that we should be concerned about with cancel culture and what it does to the landscape of religious freedom?
Jackie, I mean, practically, it means that you only have one viewpoint out in public the whole time, and that everyone is expected to conform to this viewpoint. So everyone's expected to mirror the viewpoint of the bullies, essentially. And freedom of conscience, which is part of one of the aspects of religious freedom, the right not to be forced to do something that's against your conscience or against your religion or your belief, is normally the first casualty in a war like this.
Yeah, and a war it definitely is. And of course, we also have to take into account that much of this war is fought out over social media platforms. And perhaps one of the biggest concerns in the world we live in today is that these social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google and so on, they're no longer just private companies. They are literally the town square. This is where the debate takes place. And of course, again, as you start to get ideological viewpoints almost driving these companies, then you find that more and more free speech essentially starts to get shut down and therefore effectively cancelled. And it really can be effectively cancelled. I mean, you may or may not like Donald Trump, but who would have thought that a sitting president of the United States of America, the most democratic nation, perhaps arguably in the world, with their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, would literally be deplatformed, not allowed to speak on Twitter, not allowed to speak on Facebook. When another company tried to step into the gap in the form of Parler, which is a sort of an alternative to Twitter, that got literally shut down because it was deplatformed off all the major world servers because they're controlled by another company. So it is a very concerning world that we live in, where this cancel culture is very real, but we cannot just sit and stay silent. We must find ways to make sure that our voices and our viewpoints are heard and heard clearly, because you cannot have, as Daniela said, this one-sided debate where everybody sits in their own little echo chamber and just hears what they want to hear. That is not the hallmark by any manner of means of a democratic society. That is not the hallmark of a society which celebrates diversity, which South Africa does.
Absolutely, Michael. Well, that's certainly a fitting statement to end tonight on. And Daniela, is there anything else that you would like to add to that? Because I know, again, coming back to what you guys do, because in South Africa, to a certain extent, we are proactive and we have organizations like yourselves, I think that we are hopefully flying that banner of free speech and protecting the right to our liberties, at least a bit better than some other countries. But yeah, as far as cancel culture is concerned and Christians having a voice, do we have hope of winning this fight? Do we have a chance to actually have our Christian voice represented in government and the public sphere?
Jackie, I think that first of all, I think Christians need to be aware of what's going on. And again, thank you to everyone who participated in, for example, the hate speech bill campaign to actually make their voices heard there. But the first step is to not be an ostrich with your head in the ground. It's to actually be aware of what's going on so that you know when there's something that really needs your help, like the hate speech bill, and then to get involved. And that's something that you can do by, for example, signing up for our newsletters on our website at www.forsa.org.za, or going to our Facebook page, because I mean, most of us are going to be on social media at least once a day, every day, and following us with Freedom of Religion SA, just so that you know when there's when the pawpaw strikes the fan, just so you know that. So first of all, be aware. Michael?
I think as well, be aware that there may be a price to pay. While your viewpoint is, if you like, not the acceptable viewpoint, you may have to pay a price so that your voice ultimately can be heard. And I think now of President Nelson Mandela. He literally was effectively cancelled. He was silenced. He was shut away in jail for some 27 years. And yet it took that length of time for that voice through other voices to be amplified to the point that we were able to transition remarkably and peacefully to the free and wonderful democratic South Africa that we have lived in now since 1994. So yes, speak up. Do not be intimidated. Do not allow yourself to just be silenced and shut down. Let your voice be heard. You may suffer a consequence, but in the essence of freedom, which is the most vital thing that we, I think, have that makes life worth living at all, we have to be prepared to do that, to make our voices heard, even if it costs us something. Absolutely,
Michael. So I see a comment has just come on the screen and I'm laughing because it says Jackie De Lange made the comment, but I know that it's my mom, Erin, the editor of Joy magazine, because I recognize the language. And, I just want to reiterate what she says too, that you guys are doing a remarkable job and every pastor and leader should be listening to this talk tonight. And certainly we will do our part as Joy magazine to spread this message, because Michael, you're absolutely right. There is a price to pay. However, if we get ahead of the fight, and if we are proactive and strategic, as you guys mentioned earlier on, the price to pay should be a lot less, because we proactively are defeating the ends and the evils of justice. And so, if the price to pay right now for Christians is to make the effort to sign a petition, to show up when there's a call for a protest, to attend a meeting or a briefing or a Zoom webinar on a Monday night when they could be watching a soapy, if the price to pay is to make a donation on a monthly basis or a yearly basis, or to give something to the work that you do, what a small price to pay to allow you guys to fight for our freedoms. And so I thank the Lord that he's given us people like yourselves who have wisdom, who have foreknowledge, and can use your skills for the kingdom. And I just hopefully trust that even through these webinars and the work that you do with COVID restrictions going down now, that we can get back to meeting in person, and that churches, I see there's many pastors that have signed on tonight, and I thank you as well as spiritual leaders for investing and taking the time to listen tonight, because there's none so blind as those who will not see. And as you said, Daniela, we can't be ostriches and stick our head in the ground and then 5 years down the line go, oh, what happened? How did we get here? You guys are on the front lines warning us. Joy Magazine, of course, also upholds that banner for truth and sounds the call to action. So together we take hands on that, but it cannot be done without the folks at home. So yeah, as we end tonight, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. And we have one more webinar left next week. And of course, that is going to be another important webinar. So please forward the links to your friends and your family, and make sure that if you've registered on our database, obviously you will get a reminder of the webinar, but we really want to get this message far and wide. And I encourage each one of you guys, most of you at home are obviously part of a church, please get your pastor to watch these links, because they need to know and support and follow, because really the pastors sitting on a stage are very much on the front lines under the microscope. And I'm going to hand over to you guys to say good night and goodbye. But before we go, just to let you guys know what we can expect to discuss next week. A post-Christian South Africa. What will happen to Christianity if we continue our current legal and social political trajectory? So that is quite a serious topic, but of course, very important. And again, if we are proactive, we can influence that trajectory positively, because we know that we have the Lord of the universe on our side, but the victory is ours and the battle is the Lord's, but we have to co-partner in that, because we have to do the good works of faith. It's not just handed to us. So guys, over to you to close us off for tonight.
Well, just thank you so much, everybody, for watching. We hope you found this of interest. And again, please get in touch with us. You may find yourself in a situation where somebody is trying to cancel you. And we do have legal protections. We do have legal rights in this country. And so if that is happening to you, or that that's happened to somebody because of their faith convictions particularly, then please by all means let us know. We are here to protect and promote our religious freedom rights, and wherever those rights are being eroded in the front lines, that's where you're going to find 4SA. So thank you so much for your support.
Wonderful. Daniela, thank you as well. And good luck with all the work you guys are doing. I know you've got a big court case coming up soon that you're working on. So we will certainly be watching the updates. And to everyone at home, please make sure you subscribe to 4SA's Facebook page and on their mailing list. And until next week, good night and God bless. Thanks, everybody.